Have you ever been playing a game and felt like you were living the story of the protagonist? Not in a metaphysical sense where the lines between reality and fiction blurred so much that one was indistinguishable from the other, but an experience which was visceral and personal. One which, like in a good book, had you wishing it continued for just one more scene. If, like myself, you're a fan of single-player games, I expect so. The nature of a well-polished story lends itself to this kind of absorption. Perhaps it was the quiet whistle of wind blowing through the viridescent leaves of a nearby tree, which further afield was carrying a flock of birds to their next stop, which made you feel this way. Could it have been a pneumatic pumping station painting the landscape with the scarlet blood of someone close to you? Maybe it was the questline which subverted your expectations long after you thought your previous decisions had put you in control. It's expected that narrative elements such as imagery, character, and plot let us fall in love with the world and become invested in the developments. I think this is especially true in games where the player can influence a story's direction, a quality in fiction unique to video games. But can games which don't have this curated narrative still provide us with a story? Can we feel immersed in an experience and not just a setting when we don't have a guiding companion by our side, or a yarn backed by an emphatic soundtrack to follow? I think so. By telling the stories of some of my unconventional experiences in such games, I hope to show you why. What I love about these stories, some which last a few minutes and others which build up over vast amounts of time, is how they are all different. As the constant protagonist, the similitude in my actions isn't surprising. My motivations might be different depending on the game, however my goals and what enthuses me have commonality. Yet each game provides a unique setting for the stories to take place in. There are limitations from one game to the next in what we can do and the kind of stories they encourage. Likewise, most stories benefit from characters. Sometimes they're my friends whose mannerisms are familiar and understandable, like any well-developed character in a single-player experience. This creates a dynamic setting which promotes the birth of new stories, even in the same environments. It brings fresh life to our experiences. The first story takes place in DayZ, a game I think will be familiar to many of you. As a medium for a narrative experience, DayZ is so rich because of the tumult of happenings which can occur. There are zombies and players, both thirsty for blood. Diseases which are as deadly as the glitches players of the game try to avoid like the plague. There are food shortages and an array of guns befitting a military, yet we play as a civilian trying to survive in the apocalypse. The story I wish to narrate enjoys DayZ's landscape which bears so many similarities to the rural countryside in which I live. A friend and I were running across a common hill, perhaps looking for loot or maybe a fight. What we got was both, yet not before we encountered a flock of sheep. Between us and a thicket of dense trees was a constellation of white specks grazing on the hillside. We hadn't played the game for some time, and sheep were a fresh inclusion. They were tantalizing in not only that they were new to us, but they were a source of food which can so often elude the player. We were low on ammunition for our pitiful guns, yet approached excited and ready to kill with our hatchets already being unslung from our shoulders. They were so stark amongst the grass that it was impossible to lose them, but it wasn't until one howled that we'd ever thought we'd want to. We exchanged remarks of confusion. What was that? Sheep don't howl, I can imagine us saying to each other. We couldn't have been more than 10 meters from the white cluster when one howled again, this time louder and to a backing chorus from the pack. What we had thought were sheep were actually wolves, and we'd just walked right up to them. Rather than looking down the food chain, we were now looking up it, and looking for a way out. The trees ahead seemed our best bet. The harrowing calls continued, but for a few cherished moments the wolves remained still. Maybe they were arising from a slumber or thought us so poor of equipment that we weren't worth the fight. We reached the trees, and like the traps had opened, they began to chase. We ran with no concern for anything other than the stalking beasts and stopped for naught. The prospect of losing each other in the greenery didn't register on the heartbeat monitor scaled for our fright of the wolves. We thought in DayZ we were playing a game, but as it turned out, it was the wolves playing a game. For a challenge or thrill, they had let us past only so they could catch us. They were nipping at our heels. Like sharks, they pursued with a lust for blood. It was now difficult to pick them out amongst the dark foliage which concealed them. This was especially so as our blood levels waned, and the world became a monochrome picture. Amongst the trees, we both spied a rock resting in a small body of water. The oasis was a double shot of relief. If we shared a sightline, we were close to one another. The two who thought sheep as wolves also hoped water would deter the monsters. We breached the tranquil pool and bounded up the rock no higher than either of us standing tall. And we were standing tall and smug. We laughed and rejoiced. Rock beat scissors, and so we discovered wolves too. They gathered at the base of its shallow descent into the murk we might have drunk from on another day. Their count was approaching 10. They ambled back and forth and eyed us like the predators they were, as we had the fictitious sheep. Man's superior intellect had triumphed once again. We wondered aloud if they would grow bored with watching us and scamper back to their days. A gunshot broke in the distance, and we felt ourselves returning to normality and civilization. As swift as they turned from sheep to wolves, they were dropping from our minds. All that remained was to wait for them to leave. But we discovered complacency was a terrible sickness. This was their territory we had stumbled into. No rock, nor man, or water was going to stop them. They barked and charged at the rock. As theirs, our mouths were agape, and the screams just rolled out. Our hatchets swung like pendulums. The wolves yelped as we traded blows. There was no let-up. The animals were persistent. They were determined to feast and accepted the going rate of sacrifice. I pulled the gun from my back, a weak semi-action hunting rifle. What ammunition I had could be counted on one hand. I shot with little regard for who might hear. There was a dull thud and a bloody clang. I had landed my third shot on an already afflicted wolf and it died. The celebration lasted but a moment as my friend smacked me with his hatchet and I cursed. The world turned greyer still. There was no malice in the act. Rather, destiny conspired with misfortune for the wolves to win. Yet seeing their comrade fall, and then another, and a third, gave them a chill. I was back with the hatchet, my ammunition depleted, and we continued to swing long past the retreat of the last wolf. We hastily applied what bandages we had to our wounds, and the bleeding subsided. We were low on blood, ere as our lungs panted our relief, and resources. Yet we got what we came for, food. Once we had skinned the pelts from the remains and cut up the meat, we knew our toil had been worth it. Scared to venture from our rock, and too weary to haul our spoils, the site of our battle was always to become our kitchen. My friend and I were like a pair of cavemen, virgins to fire. I directed him from a perplexing online guide while he fumbled with stones and sticks to create a campfire. We shaved bark, created a drill tool, and fashioned implements for cooking from what we had to hand. Eventually we had a crackling fire on which we roasted wolf steak galore. They turned from pink slabs to golden and chestnut life preservers which had us salivating. We knew we would be set for food after this. It wasn't long before colour returned to our world, welcomed back by the fresh blood in our bodies and the rich meat. Even the small pool offered us water which presented no complications. Had we a pot to boil and sterilise the water, we likely wouldn't have used it. We'd overcome our greatest fray, and no water-living disease would stop us. There and then we remarked upon our incredible adventure. It was as exhilarating as it was exhausting. Yet there was one page left to our story. Maybe it was the heavenly smell wafting on the fire. Some would call it justice. But I think the howl we heard was the surviving wolves inviting their kin to the fire, so they could have their own story. A story about how they returned to ravage the two boys who mistook wolves for sheep. Because although at the second howl we ran, the hustling animals as bright and as fast as light itself which spawned amongst the trees were at home in those woods, and we were not. My friend and I have spoken about that occasion numerous times since. It had that kind of impact on us. We've always harked back to that story in our subsequent encounters with wolves. To us, it was entertaining, and I think the novel nature of the experience benefited that. It was sporadic, and although I perhaps conveyed it in a serious tone, was fun. Likewise, I found great pleasure in writing about it for this video. I've never had a reason to record it before, but after doing so I could see some of the features which make it so memorable to me. First, it's personal, and I experienced it with a friend. If you take watching a movie, for instance, it's better when you have someone to discuss it with. You can laugh at the jokes and relive it from a different perspective. Second, I can see the dynamism and pace in our adventure. It twisted and developed around us for reasons presumably tucked in the game's code. Despite being there, we didn't know the wolves would return and couldn't predict it. The pace was slow when we cooked the meat, allowing the abrupt conclusion to have more impact. It didn't feel slow or boring to us because we found failing to start the fire comic, yet looking back I can see how that benefited the experience. That moment of humour might have been lost were the whole adventure at 100 miles per hour, and were it all so fast, the effect of pace may have been lost completely. Finally, I like this story so much because it occurred from the mundane. The hill was like any other, as was the forest. It emerged from nowhere. A fault of Daisy is that long periods can be spent doing ostensibly nothing, unless you count running as doing something. Because of that contrast to the norm, it was refreshing and stands out in my mind where other experiences might not because they were drab. The game series in which Daisy is built, Arma, a military simulator, is so vast and contains so many possibilities, it's no surprise I could retell stories from it with ease. The writing implement for a vast number of these fables are Arma 3 life servers. These are modified environments in which players gather to roleplay. The experience differs greatly from the base game or servers which focus on combat and tactics. As you'll see, I don't take the role-playing particularly seriously, but that's never stopped me from having fun. In fact, it's exacerbated the laughs and produced enjoyable moments. Several come to me, and at least a handful start in the drugs trade. In Arma 3 life, much like real life, nefarious activities are more profitable than legitimate ones. A player can pick apples and sell them for a pittance, or they can harvest marijuana, process the plant, and then sell it on for millions. The opportunities which unravel when one has money can seem endless. One which I've found myself in far too often playing Arma Life over the years is with my hands tied, my drugs seized, and a pair of police officers chatting before me in the front seat of their cars. Because while I find it enjoyable to play the crook, the tantalising remuneration from robbing a bank and the subsequent shootout and police chase filling me with joy at the mere thought, others choose to play as law enforcement and medics, the latter suitably representing the NHS on the British server I play on. The purpose of these roles convey our different motivations as people and how we value different things. Some are benevolent and enjoy spending their time assisting others and keeping an online world safe from criminals, and others, the majority I think, enjoy causing havoc, speeding through the streets disregarding the limit, and forming gangs which disrupt the status quo. It's a form of escapism provided by most narrative experiences like books. It's why these servers and mediums which allow us to indulge in an alternate reality are so popular. I'm not considering any of this, however, while I'm being apprehended for drug peddling. My mind was occupied by other things. 1 or 2 marijuana plants I could have disposed of in the time those piercing sirens and blinding blue lights took to catch up to me. Yet even the best magician couldn't have made the whole of an 18-wheel freight truck disappear. Besides, I earned that. I had no intention of letting it go without a fight. The lorry may have been slow, but was hefty, and the police knew that. As I swerved across the dusty 2-lane mountainous road where one mistake would be a 50s action movie explosion down the steep embankment, the police stayed back. I share my confidence with a friend beside me. The wolves may have gotten us, but these pigs hadn't a chance. I'm sure now they must have been laughing, for they knew squad cars were waiting up ahead to shoot out our tyres and bring us to an abrupt halt. They were some 20 metres ahead of us with the aim of deft marksmen, and the car behind was yet to stop. The lorry crawled on its rims in painful desperation. Waiting for and then enslaving a herd of turtles to carry us away would have been faster. My friend and I debated running, but we knew from previous escapades how we would be tased and only attain a longer rap sheet. We gingerly got out of the vehicle and awaited questioning from the surrounding officers dressed in black like a special operations task force. I don't recall what was said, but know with certainty in answer to their questions we feigned innocence. Marijuana? No, not us. We're transporting apples. The truck's not even stolen. This time, I mused with my friend. Check my license if you like. We're legit. It didn't slide. Perhaps it was the small fortune of hemp in our backpacks. Even a giant couldn't have claimed it for personal use. There was, true enough, a single apple in my bag for sustenance, but like us, it was sorely outnumbered. As they escorted us to the squad car which would take us to prison, I made a lunge at the driver's door and giddy delight sounded as I got in. Before I could make haste, the ensuing shot from the taser jolted me back to reality. My friend and I were on our way to the Altus prison. A sentence of 20 minutes awaited us. Another friend was without his helicopter. Likely he had misplaced the keys, or, more truthfully, someone had killed him and taken the keys. And that ruled out our usual escape route from the small yard of concrete construction. The police officers were friendly. After all, they had their own story to tell, and spirits were high despite the oncoming prison at the end of a long road. This wasn't a metaphorical road. Genuinely, the road to Sofia where I believe the prison was located was like a drag strip. Certainly, I had used it as such. Us and them, we shared the intimate humour of compatriots. There was one little trick the crooks had left, and it was to appeal to their sense of humour. Without a modicum of insincerity, we began to sing Queen's I Want to Break Free. With no shadow of a doubt, I can say we were terrible. Not because we didn't know the song, we both love Queen, but because, like most who think they can sing, we were delusional. A few verses down the line and we began giggling. The police pulled over, aired their impress, and set us free, ready to offend again. The marijuana was gone, but in return we attained an amusing story, and a foolproof method for escaping custody which we've tried and tested many a time now. More than the setting, this story came about because of the characters, us and the police. It could have occurred in several games, but the community which exists in Arma allowed it to flourish. The officers easily could have laughed at us, but because we treated them with respect and gave them a fair time, they did likewise to us. I'm not sure it would have unfolded as it did if they weren't British or didn't know Queen. There was a kind of bond there which we played on or exploited. Yet it was a moment which could only occur in a fictionalised setting. By all means try, but I don't think I want to break free as the Monopoly get-out-of-jail card in real life. Similarly, books and movies have restrictions which mean the story wouldn't be feasible in those mediums. Games, and particularly the online portions, can be detached from reality and provide novel opportunities which defy convention yet don't lose their enjoyability for it. What's brilliant about these experiences is how I'll tell them differently than the other participants. We each have our own perspectives which create different stories with unique voices and direction. I also think games exist as this unique blend between fiction and reality. What's occurring on my screen is fiction, it's not really happening, yet at the same time it is happening, and I'm experiencing the feelings it induces. In that sense, it's similar to books like H.G. Wells' The First Men in the Moon, a story about a scientist and a businessman who venture to the moon and find aliens living inside. The story is told from the perspective of the businessman, Mr. Bedford, recounting his time on the moon. Towards the end of the novel, we get a different perspective through the communications from the scientist, Mr. Caver. The story itself is fiction, and the contents are fiction, but the narrators tell them as if they were their life experiences. These events didn't happen, but they did for the characters, and I think when these scenes are collated into a story, it creates an interesting dynamic. The two stories I've told thus far are from online portions of games where I've been interacting with other people. Other games I've played with an online mode which I think provide this foundation for stories include Minecraft and Garry's Mod. These both have a sandbox element which promotes exploration not just in terms of setting, but also possibilities. As players, we push the limits of these games and sometimes stories emerge. Another I wanted to talk about was Rust. I even brought myself to censor the genitalia for this video. However, when I went to record my footage, this kept happening. Every single time. But I suppose that's the story of Rust. It's one of naked people trying to survive. And sometimes, albeit rarely, they get past the bears, the angry mobs, the radiation, the politics, the helicopter, and make a nice life for themselves. That's rare though, and if we look introspectively, is an appropriate yet melancholic reflection of life. And it's a curious case how some games can provide this immersion and others don't. For instance, not once have I played Rocket League and felt like a car, or the driver of a car propelled by rockets playing football. I've screamed and shouted my heart out at this game, but never lived it. I've seen myself get better at it over time, but have no narrative stories to tell. From playing Rust on the other hand, I've got a fairly good sense of what it's like to be beat with a rock. The sounds and imagery, as well as the frustration at restarting from scratch, make sure of that. I think one element which helps bring this experience to life is the other players, be it the screamers, the music players, or my friends, that give the game a lived-in sense. We're all different, and that comes through in the players we interact with. They're diverse and real. Diverse but not real are the characters of my next story, whom whilst I love dearly, and I say that with no exaggeration, sometimes look more like the alien Selenites of Wells's novel than the humans they're supposed to replicate. Unlike the others, they have a predominantly single-player existence, and one in a world bearing greater resemblance to an Excel spreadsheet than the rolling hills of a Windows wallpaper. I think this contrast makes the story noteworthy. Like all stories, it has backstory and context. Often it suits the narrative better to omit backstory, as too much will slow the tale down. However, in this story of underdogs taking place in Football Manager, FM19 to be precise, the beforehand bolsters the narrative. RB Leipzig, Lyon, Valencia, Manchester City, Manchester United, and Marseille all defeated by manager Arturo Dominici and his AC Milan side on their way to the Champions League final of 2022. Joining the club in 2018, Dominici could boast 3 Serie A titles with the Rossoneri by this time, but the honeymoon for the Milanese marriage was strictly a domestic affair. In their first foray into Europe together, the couple were ejected in the first knockout round of the Europa League by Schalke 3-1 over 2 legs. Finishing runners-up in the league netted them a position in the Champions League where they would stay until being embarrassed 4-0 in aggregate by Dortmund in the round of 16. In the 2020-21 season, AC Milan topped their group featuring Bayern Munich, remaining undefeated. But cruel fate dealt them Manchester United, British Titans, who Brexited the Italian side with a pair of 2-1 victories. Arturo Dominici may have conquered his homeland, but success on the international stage eluded him. Going into the next season on the back of another Scudetto, Dominici wanted nothing more than to advance in club football's greatest tournament, yet as it so often does, history was repeating itself. A group comprising RB Leipzig, Lyon, and Valencia was to be no walkover for the Italian side who joined them, but with the signing of Lukaku and the loan acquisition of Chiesa bolstering a tidy side, the manager had his hopes. An injury-time defeat in France sounded no air raid sirens, but thoughts of progressing in the competition were blitzed after draws against Valencia and RB Leipzig. It left AC Milan sitting on 2 points at the halfway stage and a Europa League place looking more like a target than a consolation. The outlook was bleak. But things turned. The away match in Germany finished 3-2 to the Italians and was followed by a 4-0 drubbing of Lyon back at the San Siro. The comeback was completed with a victory 2-0 in Spain, and AC Milan were left sweating atop the group on 11 points, but atop the group nonetheless. But just as the top position hadn't spared them previously, the draw handed the Italians English champions Manchester City. The serving was a bittersweet pill after saving their Champions League prospects. Nevertheless, Arturo took his side to England and earned a 1-1 draw, bettered at home by a 2-0 victory. A smile broke out on the manager's face. It was his best result in Europe yet. AC Milan then started racking up their frequent flyer miles to the home of football and the theatre of dreams with a tie against Manchester United, who would take the title off their neighbours come the season's end. With ex-United striker Romelu Lukaku in their ranks, AC Milan went from a goal down to 2-1 up, before conceding once more to finish 2 apiece at Old Trafford. A boy and his father sitting in the back of the Sir Alex Ferguson stand lamented the missed chances. The father rued Lukaku's sale a week later when in Milan he opened the scoring to help his side to a 4-2 triumph, sealing a place in the semi-final. Anyone but Napoli, Arturo had said in his customary fashion of reckoning with the teams left in the pot. Napoli were the scourge of his and Milan's domestic cup runs, and had already defeated a Paris Saint-Germain side lavished in black gold earlier in the competition. It seemed fate was favouring Dominici. His side were drawn to face France's last candidate Marseille, first away and then at home as all their ties had been. "We need to put in a professional shift in the first leg to have a chance at home," the manager had said. And Frank Kessie delivered in a year where he would become the first African winner of the World Cup with Ivory Coast. With his goal, the game finished 1-0, but he still had the reserve fixture to contend with first. And boy did Dominici's side contend. While Napoli were being trumped by Real Madrid, 10 times winners of the Cup, AC Milan were racking up their own big numbers. 6-0 at home, 7 on aggregate. Motivation had carried them from a loss and 2 draws to the Champions League final. The icing on the cake was a League and Cup double between then and their date with Real Madrid at the London City Stadium. A comfortable Serie A title and prideful win over Napoli in the Cup did little to dispel nerves in the build-up. Real Madrid were serial winners, while AC Milan were riding the crest of a wave. Dominici was proud of his boys no matter what, but to return home empty-handed would have been a sour end to the journey. The Rossoneri lined up in their conservative 4-3-3 formation with a deep block matched by Los Blancos. They boasted 5 previous winners in their fold, while AC Milan had none. But on the 28th of May 2022 they were unperturbed, and Kessie, on the back of a foul by ex-Milan loanee Hakimi on Richarlison, converted the subsequent penalty. The electronic boards lit up in the 25th minute to show 1-0 in favour of Milan, and with them Dominici's toothy grin shone. His beam was hidden by unbelieving hands holding himself together when 2 minutes later, right-winger Suso put AC Milan 2 goals ahead, and then in the 37th minute, 3 goals ahead. A pair of wonder strikes had the Reds of the crowd roaring and the Whites mulling over an early departure. Half-time came and went, exhibiting a coolness and a determination to avoid a repeat of 2005's capitulation where Liverpool turned 3-0 3-all to win on penalties, a result they never lived down. Dominici told his boys to keep going. And although the stats started to equalise, Real Madrid working their way into the game, they did. With legs tiring, on the 79th minute Dominici's first signing, the ever-reliant Bruno Fernandes alongside penalty winner Richarlison were subbed off for more defensive-minded players Zaniolo and Lucas Paqueta, who Arturo felt deserved a playing place on the winning stage. On the 86th minute, Lukaku made way for wonderkid and star of the future, 16-year-old Davide Gori. How they would remark upon the boy featuring in a Champions League final in his first season when his trophy cabinet was full, Dominici thought. It was to be the perfect story. As the game died, Suso fouled Hakimi on the edge of Milan's box. It was the 89th minute and Gareth Bale stepped up. With a sumptuous strike, bettering Suso's earlier hits, the Welshman curled the ball into the top right out of the reach of Donnarumma. Dominici scorned the lost clean sheet, but knew few would care once the final whistle was blown. It was a miraculous run to the final, and a fitting night. The Italian manager was centre stage with his team baying to conquer Europe and challenge Real's record of 10 titles. But a minute after Bale's consolation, Milan's Alex Tejes left Paulinho at the far post, and the pantomime villain turned it 3-2 with a deft header. Now incensed and wary of the football manager's curse, Dominici commanded his troops back. More, he demanded of them. A few minutes more of hard labour was all they needed. But just as their campaign had started, history was to repeat itself once more. When Casemiro struck a third across goal, Milan had surrendered a 3-goal advantage in the Champions League final. The elation of Dominici, his players and their supporters had vanished. What materialised in its place was a sense of already being defeated. 3-0, 3-1, 3-2, 3-all. It was heartbreaking, and now they were trusting a kid to get them back in it. Dominici's early victory lap had left him red-faced. He wore a malign smile. He knew what he had, only to throw it away. Downtrodden, he told the players to keep at it, and they looked glad for it. Inside they might have been dull, but they were ready for the challenge that they had been 90 minutes ago. What Dominici's opposite number, fellow Italian Allegri, had said, we don't know, but he must have been filled with vindication eclipsing Arturo's dread when in the 97th minute Christopher Ayer made it 4-3 in favour of Real Madrid. Milan's wave had sunk, and all it left behind were ripples. In a half-hearted response, care for the match gone, AC Milan changed to their 4-2-3-1 formation and chucked on Federico Chiesa on loan from Manchester City. Number 25 at the end of the squad listing, he was the last roll of the dice. No matter how many times Dominici, like the boy at Old Trafford, had watched a 1999 comeback, it belonged to the opposition on this night. The stars over London were favouring the Galacticos. The tide had turned and Milan's lead was the ruins of a sandcastle. In their altered shape, Milan pressed into the second half of extra time, but the feeling their moment was gone lingered. It was to be another Champions League season of disappointment. Dominici felt worst for the young Davide Gori, who in earnest shouldn't have been on the pitch and was doing little to merit his place. The manager knew his substitution of fable and twinkling eyes for the future was miscalculated and would be pounced upon by the media. It suited a story, but not reality. There would be no 16-year-old scorer on that night. But while all eyes watched the misfiring striker and his teary manager, there was still time on the clock, and the narrative was yet to end. Anyone who'd become lost in the drama was apt to miss Dominici's compatriot, and last-chance substitution Chiesa received the ball from Kessie in space, turn on a not-so-modest sixpence, or its Euro equivalent, and thunder in the equaliser to return a smile to his manager's face. More so than the first, second, or the third, this goal had Arturo Dominici jumping for joy. It was the best of the night, which had one more goal left to give. AC Milan 4. Real Madrid 4. Whose name was to be set in silverware? With the world watching, with 9 minutes of time left, with his manager's heart racing and his mind pleading, substitute Lucas Paqueta on the end of a headed ball from Frank Kessie glided into the box with guile and struck the calmest ball of the night past the onlooking keeper and sealed Arturo Dominici's place in the history books and a storyteller's memory as winner of the most grand Champions League final there ever was. AC Milan, Champions League winners 5, Real Madrid 4. A journey of months, years when considering the team's assembly, over a decade accounting for my time as a football fan, culminated in an unforgettable match and story, one which I had as much joy reliving as experiencing, and by no means is it the only story Football Manager has given me. I have so many moments I could talk about with similar glee, whether it's developing a homegrown talent or reuniting with a player after parting ways in years past. There's some kind of magic in this game which I think its players will appreciate, though perhaps others won't or might be oblivious to. I have this premonition that football stories have a low appeal to those who don't like the sport. A story about cars wouldn't capture my imagination the way it might others. But I think that difference of interest shows the brilliance of stories in general. There are so many that we're all bound to find something to our tastes, especially when we discover our own. The story of AC Milan's Champions League delight highlights how backstory, suspense and pacing can enhance a narrative. Originally, I opted to leave out the earlier stages of the Champions League and never considered the previous seasons. However, while I was researching the details, I found the backstory added relevant context to the piece which strengthened it and the way it captures the imagination. Arturo Dominici was a constant in the story, and we can imagine the disappointment of previous seasons being forgotten once Paqueta had scored. Furthermore, having experienced being Dominici, but telling the story in a third-person perspective allowed me to introduce moments of insight to the story. Since these occasions were fleeting, they didn't overpower the greater narrative, but offered a visceral element. Football's a team game, yet from the loss against Schalke to the win against Real Madrid, the manager was always there, so he made a good focal point. I know and love the players who contributed to the story, but it would be difficult as a viewer for you to understand these characters in the same way. Thus, it was natural to make Arturo Dominici, myself, the protagonist. After all, the game is called Football Manager. If these games are suited to create a story, are there games which aren't? Coming from experience, I think so. We've seen how other people, friends and strangers, are crucial in turning a scene into a memorable story. how games with a wide scope of possibilities are better at facilitating narrative development than narrower medias focused on a single genre or playstyle, and how backstory can make the main event more compelling and special. Of course, some like puzzle games aren't suited in any form to story creation, yet there are games which in theory should be brilliant for story making, though in practice aren't. Let me pitch a rich open world, populated by millions of players, possibilities which seem endless, regular content updates to broaden the horizons, in a game backed by an enjoyable single player which bleeds into the multiplayer. Grand Theft Auto 5 Online. It has all the features I've discussed which make these other games great canvases, yet I've never felt my story develop while playing GTA Online. This is despite being able to create and see my own character in the scenes, something which I believe helps immerse the player in the world. I think this is because whilst it's a multiplayer experience, the creators Rockstar have imposed their own characters and scripted experiences into a realm which should be dynamic and alive. The tools are there for the players to have their own stories, but they're benched for the one Rockstar wants to tell. I have no qualms with this. Earlier, I said watching a movie can be better with friends, and on paper, this should be the same. We're being told a story through characters and missions taking place in the fictional world of Los Santos, and should be able to remark upon it with mates. But I think this encroaches on the development of our own stories. In GTA Online, the characters obsessively call you to the point you wonder how they pay the phone bills. It's so much that you learn to ignore them. Similarly, the narrative being told, unlike the exciting single player, is dull and fails to capture the imagination. I think this is in part due to our protagonist's silence. When I'm experiencing a game's single player for the first time, I usually play it in solace so I can appreciate the plot and story. I want to be immersed, enthralled, and enthused. This is at odds with a narrative being explored while I banter with friends. None of us have ever been interested enough in the online story to stop talking amongst ourselves while the cinematics play. Fine, this is an online experience. It doesn't matter if the narrative isn't as strong as the story-driven single player. And my friends and myself are a small sample group, yet its presence hinders the opportunities for players to have their own story. Bombarding phone calls, scripted segments, and hostile players in the environment actively prohibit our own story taking place. This is a real shame. The setting is ripe for dynamic events, even moments which are unique to the player. However, it all feels so curated, with every detail being toyed with until they interlock like bricks of Lego. This leads to a stagnation in creativity, a preoccupation of our imaginations, and disappointment for those who enjoy having their own experiences. None of what I've just said makes the game bad though. I love Lego. Like a cookery book, GTA Online caters for something different. I don't know if the creators of any game I've mentioned want the players to have their own stories, yet some encourage it more than others. I think, however, if every game tried for this end, then we'd become saturated in half-baked experiences which not only don't live up to their potential, but harm the capacity to make our own moments. As good as it is to create, sometimes we need to observe and enjoy someone else's story. We should be glad to have games which offer their own narratives, and then those which allow us to create our own. I believe that contrast makes our stories even more special when they do come to fruition. In knowing this, and having looked at what makes a game a fertilized vineyard for ripe experience, I hope you can find and live out your own stories. Retell them and enjoy them. May they be as special to you as mine are to me. Thank you for listening.